It was a quiet spring morning in South Korea, March 26, 1991. The sky hung gray over the small city of Daegu. Children laughed in the streets. Birds chirped from trees still bare from winter. Life moved slowly, but before the sun would set, 5 boys would vanish into thin air forever. They were never supposed to go far, just a short walk, a small adventure into the woods behind their homes. Harmless, ordinary, but they never came back. And what happened in those woods? What was later found would haunt a nation for decades. This is the story of the Frog Boys, and it begins with a lie, a beautiful lie we tell ourselves every day. That could never happen here. Jong-sik, Yong-gyu, Ho-yeon, In-soo, and Cheol-won, 5 ordinary boys aged 9 to 13, best friends from the same neighborhood. They loved games, climbing hills, and catching tadpoles, what they called frogs, in the shallow creeks around Mount Warayong. That's where they were headed that day. That's where they disappeared. The morning started like any other. One by one, they left home. No school that day. It was a national holiday, election day. They waved to their mothers, promised to be home soon, and vanished into the forested hills. But evening came, and their parents waited and waited. The sun dipped behind the mountains. Shadows stretched across Daegu. Still no boys. Panic spread like fire. Their parents began to search. Neighbors joined, then police, then military. The hills echoed with desperate calls. Yong-gyu, Jong-sik, can you hear us? But the forest remained silent. Authorities launched one of the largest manhunts in South Korean history. Over 300,000 people scoured the hills. Soldiers with search dogs combed every path. Helicopters flew overhead. Drones of feet stamped through the dirt, overturning every rock and digging through every bush. Nothing. No clothes, no footprints, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Whole days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and then years. Rumors grew. Some said the boys had run away. Others whispered they'd been kidnapped. Organ trafficking, human experimentation, American military involvement, cults. The police had no answers. The parents had no peace. They marched with photos of their sons, stood in the streets holding candles, pleaded on TV, and then 11 years later, the truth emerged, and it was darker than anyone imagined. It was September 2002. A man was hiking on Mount Warayong, not far from where the boys had vanished. He stumbled upon something strange. Torn pieces of clothing, weathered old. He looked closer. Bones, children's bones. He called the police, and when forensic teams arrived, they uncovered the remains of all 5 boys buried together, half hidden under leaves and soil, less than 3 kilometers from their homes. 11 years, the answer had been right there, hiding in plain sight. But it wasn't just the discovery that shocked the nation. It was what had been done to them. Skulls were fractured. One had a bullet wound. Arms and ribs were broken. Some still had melted plastic wire wrapped around them. This was no accident, no lost hikers, no runaway boys. This was murder, cold-blooded, brutal, unforgiving. The police were forced to admit what they had denied for over a decade. These boys hadn't gotten lost. They had been hunted. The question was, by whom? News spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed across every paper, remains of missing frog boys found. The public was enraged. How could a search so massive, so relentless, have missed 5 bodies buried in a shallow grave? And even more terrifying, how could no one hear them scream? The site was barely off the trail. Local hikers walked that hill every week. The area had been searched multiple times. The parents had climbed those very slopes. Some claimed they'd even camped overnight near that same spot. So how were the boys only discovered in 2002? One theory chilled everyone to the bone. What if they were killed? Long after they disappeared, the discovery of the bones raised more questions than it answered. Autopsies were conducted by forensic teams. The results were grim: skull fractures, puncture wounds, trauma inconsistent with accidental injury. One skull had a clearly defined bullet hole, small caliber, close range. Others showed signs of blunt force. Trauma possibly from a metal rod or tool, ropes, wires, plastic bindings. all melted into the decaying clothes and bones. It was overkill, deliberate, slow, cruel, and then came the detail that haunted even the coldest investigators. The bodies were found huddled together, as if they'd clung to each other in their final moments, as if they knew no one was coming to save them. Police tried to save face. They claimed poor equipment and inexperience had prevented earlier discovery, that the terrain was rough, visibility poor, but the public wasn't buying it. Neither were the parents. A decade of false hope had ended in tragedy, and now the very system that was supposed to protect their children had failed them again. But the worst part, the killer or killers were still out there, somewhere watching, listening, smiling, because in the chaos, no suspects were ever officially named, no arrests made, no one held accountable. Theories began to flood the airwaves. Some claimed it was a deranged hunter. Others suggested military involvement. Mount Warayong had long been used for military exercises. What if the boys stumbled onto something they shouldn't have seen? A hidden stash, a secret drill, live weapon. What if they witnessed something and someone made sure they stayed silent forever? One theory pointed to an ex-soldier who had returned to Daegu shortly before the boys vanished. He had a criminal record. He knew the woods. He was unstable, but no hard evidence ever tied him to the scene. Another theory was darker still, ritualistic killing. The way the bodies were positioned, the bindings, the lack of valuables taken. It wasn't robbery. It wasn't random. It was precise, calculated, personal, but no one could prove it, and the deeper the police looked, the more questions emerged. Why didn't the dogs pick up the scent back then? Why did military helicopters fly over that exact hill during the original search and claim they saw nothing? Why were the boys' shoes found neatly placed beside them, not scattered, not torn? Who buries 5 children together and arranges their remains? This wasn't just murder. This was a message. The media storm exploded. The nation that once prayed for the boys' safe return now demanded justice. Parents of the victims, once filled with hope, now filled with rage, they stood in front of news cameras, holding their son's bones, their voices trembling with fury. They said it was an accident, that our sons got lost. One father cried, "But look at these skulls, my son was shot." What kind of accident is that? Public trust in law enforcement collapsed. Protests erupted outside police headquarters. In Daegu, the parents begged, no, demanded, the case be reopened as homicide, and so it was. A new task force was assembled, forensic experts, crime scene analysts, psychologists. But there was a problem. Time, 11 years had passed. Crucial evidence had degraded. Witnesses had moved, grown older, forgotten details. The original case files sloppy, incomplete. Some reports were missing entirely. It was as if the investigation had been designed to fail. The new team combed through what was left. One detail caught their attention: a series of anonymous phone calls made shortly after the disappearance. A man had called one of the boys' homes. He said he'd seen children crying in a car driven by someone in uniform. The voice was never identified. The tip buried. Now it resurfaced like a ghost from the past. Could it have been a police officer? A soldier someone trusted, someone the boys wouldn't have run from? A witness also came forward. Too afraid to speak at the time, she said she saw the boys near a military training site the morning they disappeared. They were laughing, throwing stones into a creek. Then she heard shouting. Grown men, orders, then nothing. No one had followed up on her statement. 11 years wasted, and then came photograph, a chilling, faded photograph discovered in the belongings of one of the deceased's family. It was taken weeks before the disappearance. 5 boys standing on the edge of the forest. In the background, barely visible, was a shadowy figure watching from between the trees. Zoomed in, it was impossible to tell if it was a person, but parents swore it wasn't there when the photo was taken. Paranoia took over. Whoever did this had known the area, had known the boys, had stalked them, waited, planned. But the more the new team searched, the colder the trail became. Witnesses changed stories. Records were incomplete, leads vanished. Then the ultimate insult. The statute of limitations on the case was about to expire under South Korean law. At the time, murder cases could only be prosecuted within 15 years. The clock was ticking. And then it stopped in 2006. The clock ran out, the case was officially closed. The killer or killers had gotten away with it, and unless someone confessed, they always would. For the families, time didn't heal. It only deepened the wound. They'd lived 11 years in agony, clinging to a lie that maybe, just maybe, their sons were alive somewhere, that one day the door would open, that small shoes would walk back in, that a familiar voice would shout, "I'm home." But instead they received boxes filled with bones. They held what was left of their children in trembling hands, tiny clothes shredded and faded, fragments of shoes, melted plastic, pieces of rope, bits of skull, all arranged in clear evidence bags. One mother fainted as she held her son's cracked glasses. Another refused to eat for days. Sitting beside the small white coffin, a father poured his life savings into private detectives, desperate for a name, a face, a reason. But there was no reason, no logic, no mercy, just silence. South Korea mourned and then moved on, but the parents couldn't. They built a memorial at the site where the boys were found, 5 statues of young boys smiling, frozen in bronze, their arms outstretched as if chasing frogs, unaware of what waited behind the trees and beneath them. An inscription we will never forget. But forgetting was exactly what the system did. No suspect, no motive, no justice. Just 5 boys taken, buried silence to this day. The Frog Boys case remains one of South Korea's greatest mysteries, but beneath the surface are darker whispers. Rumors the public never forgot, that someone in power knew the truth, that there was a cover-up, that it wasn't just murder, it was a message to stay silent, that the killer walked among them still, perhaps with medals on his chest, or a uniform neatly hung in a closet. Some pointed fingers at the military. Others blamed local politicians or corrupt investigators. One former detective even claimed evidence had been deliberately hidden, that internal orders told them not to treat the case as a murder. Why? Because exposing the truth might uncover more than just a killer. It might expose a system built on fear, silence, and shame, and yet no one came forward. No confession, no whistleblower, no deathbed admission. The silence screamed louder than ever. Years passed. The names of the boys faded from headlines. The memorial gathered dust. Tourists came and went from Daegu. Unaware, they walked through a town built on heartbreak. But for some, the case never ended. A small group of journalists, internet investigators, and true crime obsessives refused to let it go. They pored over every scrap of evidence, every news article, every contradictory police report. What they found only deepened the suspicion. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a cover-up. Let's talk about what didn't make the mainstream news first, the original search. Records and early reports, officers claimed that they had searched the exact location where the bodies were later found. Multiple times, they said it was cleared by ground patrol and aerial surveillance, so why were 5 bodies missed? Some believe they weren't there until much later, that someone returned and placed the remains years after the murders. Maybe they were buried elsewhere. Maybe they were hidden. And when the heat died down, someone moved them. Why? Because the case was about to go cold and someone wanted it closed their way. Second, the plastic wire found melted into the boys' clothing. It wasn't ordinary household wire. It resembled military-grade binding, the kind used in field operations, strong, heat-resistant, manufactured for durability in extreme conditions. Who would have access to that? Third, the bullet wound in one of the skulls. Authorities claimed it could have been a sharp rock or blunt trauma, but independent forensics disagreed. They said it was a perfect circular puncture, consistent with a small caliber round, possibly from a .22 caliber weapon, a hunting rifle, a military sidearm, or an improvised silenced weapon. Why downplay it? And then there was the behavioral pattern. Whoever killed the boys didn't panic, didn't rush, They had time. They chose a shallow grave, arranged the bodies, placed their shoes neatly beside them. That's not chaos. That's control. Psychologists say this points to someone calm under pressure, disciplined, possibly trained. The theory: a local hunter with mental illness, a rogue soldier on unauthorized maneuvers, or a military officer who killed them after they witnessed something they shouldn't have. And yet, no investigation ever looked at active military rosters. No list of nearby hunters was released, no psychological profiles made public, instead silence officially. The case is closed unofficially. It's anything but. The death of the Frog Boys didn't just break 5 families, it shattered a nation's sense of safety. In the aftermath, South Korea was forced to confront something it didn't want to admit: that its systems, police, government, military, were not only fallible but possibly complicit in silence. The case became a symbol of failure, of negligence, of deep, terrifying corruption. The parents of the boys weren't just heartbroken, they were betrayed. They had believed in the justice system. They trusted the government. They gave interviews, campaigned, prayed, but in the end, the people. They begged for help and failed them, and the killer vanished into the shadows. The aftermath sparked public outcry, not just about the investigation, but the law itself. South Korea's 15-year statute of limitations on murder was suddenly under fire. How could a time limit exist on something so horrific? Why should a killer be protected just because they were patient? The outcry grew so loud that in 2015, 24 years after the boys vanished, the South Korean government finally changed the law. The statute of limitations for murder was abolished. It was too late for the Frog Boys, but not for others. It was their parents, worn, aged, and full of grief, who helped make it happen. They stood in front of the National Assembly with photos of their sons refusing to let the world forget, and still, even with the law changed, no one came forward. No new leads, no surprise confessions, no anonymous letters. Only rumors like a whisper in the trees. The case became legend, passed down like a ghost story. Children in Daegu grew up hearing it. Don't go into the woods, they'd say. The Frog Boys never came back. And yet, something about the case kept drawing people in. True crime documentaries, podcasts, even dramatized films were made about the tragedy. Each one tried to make sense of the senseless, to answer the questions that had tormented a country. But they all came back to the same place, the same hollow ache. There was no ending, no justice. Only 5 young boys frozen in time, trapped in a mystery darker than any fiction, and still their parents wait, not for a miracle, not for closure, but for truth, for someone to finally speak. Would you like me to continue with the final section? It contains the most chilling theory. The idea that they may have known the killer as time passed. One question refused to die: why those 5 boys? Was it random? Wrong place, wrong time? Or was it something more calculated, more personal? There was one theory buried under years of official denials and public fatigue. A theory so disturbing, so uncomfortable, that few dared to say it out loud. What if the boys knew their killer? All 5 of them. Think about it, 5 children aged 9 to 13, curious, energetic, brave, in that invincible way only children can be. Would they follow a stranger deep into the woods? Unlikely. But what if the person who approached them wasn't a stranger at all? What if it was a neighbor, a teacher, a coach, a family friend, someone with authority, someone they trusted, someone who smiled, made a joke, offered a shortcut to the stream, or even asked for help? The kind of person who wouldn't raise alarm. That would explain everything: the lack of struggle, the neatness of the crime scene, the shoes placed together, the fact that no one heard screams, the calm, methodical placement of the bodies, the use of binding materials that required access, not just to tools, but to confidence. A killer who didn't panic because he never had to rush, because he knew the boys wouldn't run, because he knew they trusted him. Some investigators began to privately suspect this was an act not of impulse or rage, but of grooming, of slow manipulation, of gaining trust over time, luring them in one by one, and then taking everything from them forever. This theory sent shivers through the community because if true, it meant the killer wasn't a drifter, or a rogue soldier, or a mysterious stranger. It meant he was someone who lived among them, someone who walked the same streets, shopped at the same markets, smiled at grieving parents, attended memorials, pretending, performing, hiding in plain sight. The idea was too horrifying for most to accept, because if that were true, it meant the Frog Boys were not just victims, they were chosen. In the years that followed, the case of the Frog Boys became more than a mystery, it became a warning. Parents across South Korea clutched their children's hands a little tighter. Schools rolled out new safety policies. Neighborhood watch groups sprang up. Overnight strangers were no longer welcomed with smiles, but met with suspicion, because if 5 innocent boys could vanish just minutes from their homes on a public holiday in broad daylight, then whose child was truly safe? And the worst part, the fear never really left. Even now, decades later, ask an older resident of Daegu, watch how their face changes, how their voice drops, how their eyes drift toward the forested hills, as if they still hear the search parties, still remember the names echoing through the trees, even if they weren't related. The grief became personal because it could have been any child, any family, any town. Government tried to move on. Textbooks mentioned it. Briefly, police training cited it as an example of failure. Politicians gave speeches pledging community trust, but none of it changed what happened. None of it brought justice for the parents. Hope turned to obsession. They aged grayed, withered, but their eyes stayed sharp. They watched every face. They scanned every crowd. They searched forums, bulletins, comments, still listening, still waiting for a name, a voice, a slip, because what haunted them most wasn't just that their sons died. It was that whoever did it might still be free, might be smiling, teaching, raising a family, wearing a badge, waving in the street. And the government, the system, had nothing left to offer, just apologies and cold closed case files. But for the families, it's not over, it never will be. They say time heals all wounds, but some wounds don't heal. They scar, they fester, they whisper. For the families of the Frog Boys, time brought no peace. Only distance from a smile, a meal, a laugh. The sound of footsteps running down the street, the clatter of screen doors. The last words spoken before 5 little lives disappeared into the trees. They remember every detail, every second, moments that were ordinary in any other family. But in theirs, they are sacred, they are final. What remains? A hillside, a memorial. 5 bronze statues frozen in play, guarding the mountain that swallowed them whole. Tourists come. They leave offerings, toys, candy, flowers. Notes. One note simply said, "I never knew you, but I wish I could have protected you." Signed only with a first name, maybe. That's what the world still feels, guilt, because this wasn't just a failure of police or military or government. It was a failure of all of us to speak, to demand truth, to break the silence, because silence has never been justice. It's only ever been a cage, and somewhere out there someone still holds the key. Someone knows what happened. Someone sees those 5 faces every time they close their eyes, because the only thing harder than committing a crime like this is carrying its secret for a lifetime. The Frog Boys case is a wound, a shadow carved into South Korea's soul. 5 boys vanished, 5 voices silenced, and with them, an entire nation lost its innocence. Decades passed, statutes expired, memories faded for some, but not for the families. Not for those who walk the mountain paths, not for those clutching old photographs, still whispering names into the cold air. Not for those who believe deep in their bones that the truth will not stay buried forever, because one day someone will speak, someone will break the silence, and the shadows will lift. Until then, the Frog Boys wait, waiting for justice, waiting for peace, waiting for a voice in the dark. And if you listen closely, really listen, you can still hear them. 5 voices calling out through the trees, remember us.